The morning alarm echoed through the corridors of Terminus 7 Academy, but Tom Bradley was already awake. He had been staring at the ceiling for hours, knowing what today would bring. The old human slowly dressed in his cadet uniform, the fabric rough against skin, marked by decades of space service. At 72, he was easily the oldest student in the academy, but age had its privileges. Nobody asked too many questions about why he was there. The classroom buzzed with excited chatter as young aliens from across the galaxy settled into their seats. Tall, blue-skinned beings from the ice worlds compared notes with their smaller reptilian classmates. Near the front, a group of aquatic students floated in their environmental suits, their gills fluttering with anticipation. They all knew today's lesson would be special. Commander Dex strode into the room with military precision. His gray skin gleamed under the artificial lights, and his four arms moved independently as he activated the holographic display system. The Altarian had a reputation for brutal honesty in his military history classes, never sugarcoating the harsh realities of galactic warfare. Today we examine one of the most foolish military decisions in recorded history, Dex announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen real combat. The humans of Earth, faced with impossible odds, chose emotion over logic. They chose death over surrender. The holographic projector hummed to life, filling the center of the room with a three-dimensional map of a small solar system. A blue-green world hung suspended in the artificial starlight, surrounded by the tiny dots that represented defending ships. Beyond them, stretching to the edge of the display, was an ocean of red dots marking the positions of the attacking fleet. The Battle of Sol, Dex continued, manipulating the display to show the massive disparity in numbers. 10,000 Dominion warships against 300 human vessels. Any rational species would have evacuated their homeworld and regrouped elsewhere. The humans chose to stay and fight. A young crystalline being raised a glittering appendage. Commander, why would they make such an obviously suicidal choice? Dex's expression showed something between pity and disgust. Because humans are driven by primitive emotions rather than logical military doctrine. They allowed attachment to their birth world to override basic survival instincts. Tom Bradley remained silent in his corner seat, his weathered hands folded on his desk. He watched the holographic Earth rotate slowly, remembering how beautiful it had looked from the bridge of the UES Defiance all those decades ago. How young he had been, how terrified, how proud. The display zoomed in to show individual ships, their designs crude compared to modern galactic standards. The human vessels looked like metal cylinders with engine pods bolted on, lacking the elegant curves and advanced materials of their alien contemporaries. Several students chuckled at the primitive appearance. Observe the technological disparity, Dex lectured, highlighting various ships. Human weapons were primarily kinetic projectiles and nuclear warheads. The Dominion forces possessed energy shields, plasma cannons, and faster-than-light communication systems. This should have been a massacre completed within hours. A reptilian student hissed thoughtfully. How long did the battle actually last, Commander? Dex paused, his four hands hovering over the control interface. The engagement continued for 17 hours and 43 minutes, far longer than any reasonable projection suggested. Tom's lips twitched slightly. 17 hours and 43 minutes. He remembered every one of those minutes. The growing confusion in Dominion communications as their easy victory turned into a grinding nightmare. The moment when their confident laughter became worried chatter, then desperate screams. The historical record shows several anomalies in this engagement, Dex admitted reluctantly. The human forces displayed tactics that defied conventional military wisdom. They seemed to become more dangerous as their casualties mounted, rather than less effective. The holographic display began running the battle footage in real time, though compressed for classroom viewing. The first wave of Dominion ships approached Earth's defensive perimeter with casual arrogance, their formations loose and undisciplined. They expected token resistance before the inevitable surrender. Instead, they flew directly into the most sophisticated minefield ever constructed. The students gasped as explosions blossomed throughout the display. Dominion dreadnoughts, ships the size of small cities, vanished in brilliant flashes of nuclear fire. The seemingly random positioning of human vessels suddenly revealed itself as a carefully planned killing ground, with overlapping fields of fire and pre-positioned weapon platforms. The humans had been preparing for this battle for months, Dex explained, his voice carrying grudging respect. They turned their entire solar system into a fortress, mining asteroid belts and positioning hidden weapon caches throughout local space. But the most shocking aspect of the footage was the human communications. As their own ships began taking damage as friends and comrades died around them, the human voices remained steady, professional, and strangely cheerful. They reported catastrophic damage with the same tone others might use to discuss the weather. Hull, breach on decks 7 through 12, came one transmission from a burning human cruiser, but our main guns are still operational, and we've got a beautiful shot at that carrier formation. Tom closed his eyes and heard Lieutenant Sarah's voice again, exactly as it had sounded that day. She had died 2 minutes after that transmission, when a Dominion plasma bolt punched through the cruiser's reactor shielding. But she had taken the carrier with her. The alien students watched in growing amazement as the battle continued to unfold. Ships that should have retreated instead pressed their attacks. Crews that should have abandoned their posts instead fought harder. The Dominion forces, despite their overwhelming numerical advantage, began to show signs of confusion and fear. "This is not normal military behavior," whispered one of the aquatic students. "Where is their self-preservation instinct?" Commander Dex manipulated the display to show casualty figures in real time. The human losses were staggering, climbing towards 70% destroyed or disabled, but the Dominion losses were climbing, too, far beyond what their commanders had expected for what should have been a simple conquest. The key factor in this engagement, Dex said slowly, was that humans appear to lack the standard military concept of acceptable losses. Most galactic species will surrender when casualties reach 30 to 40%. Humans continued fighting until they had nothing left to fight with. In the back corner of the classroom, Tom Bradley opened his eyes and watched the holographic recreation of his youth. He saw the UES Defiance, his old ship, taking fire from 3 different directions while still maintaining her position in the defensive line. He remembered the smell of smoke and ozone, the sound of damage reports flooding the communications channels, the way his hands had shaken as he transmitted target coordinates to the fleet. But mostly he remembered the moment when everything changed. When the Dominion fleet, despite having the humans outnumbered and outgunned, made a decision that shocked the galaxy. They retreated. The holographic display showed the massive alien fleet beginning to withdraw from Earth's orbital space. Their formations broken and demoralized. What should have been humanity's final defeat had become something else entirely. And that, Commander Dex concluded, is why emotional decision-making has no place in proper military doctrine. The humans chose to fight and die rather than accept the logical outcome of surrender. Tom Bradley remained silent, but his mind was already preparing the words he would soon speak. Words that would change everything these young aliens thought. They knew about humans, about warfare, and about the day that changed the galaxy forever. The holographic display shifted to show the Dominion fleet in all its terrible glory. Row after row of massive warships stretched across the projection, each one capable of destroying entire cities with a single blast. The alien students stared, in awe at the sheer scale of the attacking force. Commander Dex gestured toward the largest vessels in the formation. These are Dominion world breakers, each measuring over 2 kilometers in length. Their plasma cannons could melt through a mountain. In seconds, their shields could deflect any weapon known to galactic science at that time. The human defensive fleet looked pathetic by comparison. 300 ships scattered throughout Earth's solar system, most of them barely the size of a single Dominion destroyer. Their hulls were rough metal plating, their weapons primitive by galactic standards. They looked more like industrial equipment than military vessels. A young reptilian cadet raised his clawed hand. "Commander, how did the humans expect to damage ships with such advanced defensive systems?" Dex zoomed in on one of the human vessels, highlighting its weapon ports. They used kinetic projectiles, metal slugs fired at high velocity. The Dominion command staff found this so primitive they were genuinely amused. Their energy shields were designed to deflect plasma and laser attacks, not solid matter. Tom Bradley shifted in his seat, remembering the laughter that had echoed through intercepted Dominion communications. The alien commanders had joked about fighting with Stone Age weapons and placing bets on how quickly the conquest would be completed. Some had wagered it would take less than an hour. The battle footage continued, showing the first moments of contact. Dominion ships approached Earth's defensive perimeter in loose formations, their commanders confident that no serious resistance was possible. Their shields glowed with protective energy, their weapons charged and ready to deliver overwhelming firepower. Then the first mines detonated, the classroom filled with gasps as massive explosions erupted throughout the Dominion formation. Ships that had seemed invulnerable suddenly found themselves damaged, their shields flickering under the assault of carefully placed nuclear devices. The loose formations dissolved into chaos as commanders realized they had flown into a trap. The humans had spent months preparing the battlefield, Dex explained, his voice carrying grudging admiration. They mined every approach route to Earth, placed weapon platforms in asteroid fields, and positioned their defensive fleet to create overlapping kill zones. But what shocked the alien students most was the human response to taking damage in return. As Dominion plasma bolts began finding their targets, human ships exploded in brilliant flashes. Entire crews died in seconds, yet the human communications remained calm and professional. "Direct hit on the Yorktown," came one transmission. "She's breaking apart, but her reactor's still stable. Ram course laid in for the nearest world breaker." The students watched in horrified fascination as the dying human destroyer accelerated toward a Dominion capital ship. The alien vessel tried to maneuver away, but the human pilot had already calculated the intercept course. The collision was spectacular, both ships vanishing in a sphere of nuclear fire. "This behavior violates every principle of rational military doctrine," muttered one of the crystalline beings. "They are destroying themselves along with the enemy." Tom remembered the pilot of the Yorktown, Lieutenant Rodriguez, fresh from the academy and younger than Tom himself. The man had volunteered for the suicide run without hesitation, joking over the comm that he had always wanted to see if a destroyer could take out a dreadnought in single combat. The battle footage showed more impossible scenes. Human fighters. Their engines shot away, used their dying moments to ram into Dominion bombers. Human cruisers with their main guns destroyed turned themselves into guided missiles, their crews riding them all the way to impact. Every human loss became a weapon against the enemy. "Observe the psychological effect on Dominion forces," Dex pointed out, highlighting communications from the alien fleet. The confident chatter had become worried exchanges between ship commanders. The casual arrogance was replaced by growing fear. "They are insane," came one Dominion transmission. "They fight like animals backed into a corner." "Request immediate reinforcements," came another. "These humans do not follow standard combat protocols." A third voice, higher pitched with panic. "They just used their medical ship as a bomb. They turned a hospital ship into a weapon." The alien students looked disturbed by this revelation. In galactic warfare, medical vessels were considered sacred, never to be attacked or used as weapons. The idea of deliberately destroying a hospital ship, even your own, was unthinkable to civilized species. Tom closed his eyes, remembering the UES Mercy. She had been carrying wounded from the outer defense stations when Dominion fighters broke through the defensive line. Rather than allow the patients to be captured or executed, the medical staff had volunteered to ram their ship into a Dominion troop transport. 300 human wounded and 50 medical personnel had died, but they had taken 2,000 enemy soldiers with them. The holographic display showed the battle reaching its climax. Nearly half the human fleet was gone, burning wrecks scattered throughout the solar system. But the Dominion losses were mounting too, far beyond what their commanders had expected. Ships designed to conquer worlds were being destroyed by vessels that looked like mining equipment. The turning point came when human forces began using their damaged vessels as guided weapons, Dex explained. Rather than abandon ship when critically damaged, Human crews would instead set collision courses with high-value targets. The footage showed a human battleship, her hull cracked open and bleeding atmosphere, making a final run at a Dominion command vessel. The alien ship tried to retreat, but the human captain had timed his attack perfectly. The collision destroyed both vessels, but also disrupted the Dominion's command structure. Communication breakdown in the enemy fleet, came a transmission from another human ship. Their formation discipline is collapsing. All ships press the attack. What followed was unlike anything in recorded military history. The human fleet, reduced to less than 100 functional vessels, launched a coordinated assault on the remaining Dominion forces. Ships that should have been retreating instead accelerated toward the enemy. Crews that should have been demoralized by their losses instead seemed energized by the prospect of taking more enemies with them. The alien students watched in stunned silence as the massive Dominion fleet began to show signs of panic. Ships designed to intimidate entire civilizations were pulling back from combat with primitive human vessels. Commanders who had laughed at human military capability were now requesting permission to withdraw from the battle. "This is not possible," whispered one of the aquatic students. "How can the larger force be retreating?" Commander Dex paused the display, his four hands hovering uncertainly over the controls. The historical record shows that Dominion commanders began to question the strategic value of continuing the assault. Their casualty rates had exceeded all projections. Tom Bradley allowed himself a small smile. He remembered the exact moment when the tide had turned. When the Dominion Fleet Commander, Admiral Korthak, had sent a direct transmission to Earth's surface demanding immediate surrender. The response had come not from Earth's government, but from the captain of a burning human cruiser. "Come and take it," had been the entire message. The battle footage resumed, showing the final phase of the engagement. The Dominion fleet, despite still outnumbering the humans by more than 10-1, had lost its will to fight. Ships that could have easily destroyed the remaining human forces instead began forming up for withdrawal. "The enemy fleet is pulling back," came a transmission from one of the surviving human vessels. "Repeat, Dominion forces are retreating from Earth orbital space." The classroom fell silent as the implications sank in. The massive alien fleet, with its advanced technology and overwhelming numbers, was abandoning the conquest of a primitive world because the cost had become too high. The humans had not won the battle in any traditional sense, but they had made victory too expensive for their enemies to afford. Commander Dex cleared his throat uncomfortably. The official historical record classifies this engagement as a tactical victory for Dominion forces due to the higher human casualty rates. In the back corner of the classroom, Tom Bradley finally spoke. "Sometimes the history books get things wrong." The entire classroom turned to stare at the elderly human in the corner. Tom Bradley had been silent throughout the lesson, but now every alien eye was fixed on him. Commander Dex's four arms tensed, clearly annoyed at the interruption. "Cadet Bradley," Dex said coldly. "The historical record is based on extensive documentation from both sides of the conflict. Unless you have evidence to contradict established facts, I suggest you remain silent." Tom slowly rose from his chair, his joints protesting after sitting still for so long. The young aliens around him seemed suddenly aware of his presence in a way they had not been before. There was something in his manner, a quiet authority that commanded attention. "I do have evidence, Commander," Tom said quietly. "I was there." The words fell into the classroom like stones into still water. Several students gasped audibly. The crystalline beings began to glow with excitement, while the reptilian cadets hissed softly among themselves. Even the aquatic students stopped their gentle floating to focus entirely on the old human. Commander Dex's gray skin flushed a darker shade. "That is impossible. The Battle of Sol occurred 53 years ago. The human casualties were so severe that very few survivors remained to provide testimony." Tom nodded slowly. "That part is true. We lost a lot of good people that day. But some of us made it through." He looked around the room at the young faces staring at him. "I was 19 years old, fresh from the academy, communications officer aboard the UES Defiance." He gestured toward the frozen holographic display, where the human battlecruiser hung suspended in artificial starlight. "That ship right there." She was a good ship with a good crew. Most of them never made it home. A young reptilian cadet raised his hand tentatively. "But the records say there were no survivors from the human fleet command structure. How did you escape?" Tom's expression grew distant. "Who said anything about escaping? I said I was there. I never said I ran away." He walked slowly toward the front of the classroom, his weathered hands clasped behind his back. The Defiance took 17 direct hits during the battle. Our engine room was destroyed, our hull was breached in 37 places, and our main reactor was minutes away from critical failure. The alien students listened in fascination as Tom continued. "But we kept fighting. Even when our weapon systems went offline, even when life support began failing, we kept our position in the battle line. Because that is what humans do when our backs are against the wall." Commander Dex's voice carried a note of uncertainty. "The official reports indicate that human forces were completely overwhelmed by Dominion technology and numbers." "The official reports," Tom said with a slight smile, "were written by politicians who needed to explain why the greatest military force in the galaxy had been fought to a standstill by what they called a primitive species." Tom reached the holographic display and placed his hand on the control interface. The image shifted, zooming in on the UES Defiance during the height of the battle. The ship's hull was scarred and blackened, her armor plating torn away in several places, but her guns were still firing. "Look at the timestamp on this image," Tom instructed. 14 hours and 27 minutes into the engagement. According to Dominion tactical doctrine, human resistance should have collapsed within the first hour. The alien students studied the display with new eyes. The human ship looked like it was falling apart, but it was still in formation with the other survivors, still fighting, still refusing to yield ground to an enemy that should have swept them aside without effort. "The thing about humans," Tom continued, "is that we get stubborn when someone tries to take our home away. The worse the odds get, the harder we fight. It does not make logical sense, but it is who we are." One of the crystalline beings raised a glittering appendage. "But surely you must have known the battle was hopeless. Why continue fighting when defeat was inevitable?" Tom's eyes grew hard. "Because defeat was not inevitable. It was just expensive." He manipulated the display to show Dominion casualty reports. "Look at these numbers, really look at them." The holographic readout showed Dominion losses climbing steadily throughout the battle. Ships destroyed, personnel killed, resources expended. What had started as a routine conquest had become the most costly military operation in Dominion history. By hour 10, they had lost more ships than in any previous battle, Tom explained. By hour 15, their casualty rate was approaching critical levels. By hour 17, their fleet commanders were asking headquarters if the conquest of one human world was worth bankrupting their entire military. Commander Dex studied the display with obvious discomfort. "These casualty figures are higher than the official histories suggest." "The official histories," Tom said firmly, "were written by the Dominion to save face after what became the greatest military disaster in their history. They called it a victory because they could not admit that a species they considered primitive had nearly destroyed their entire invasion fleet." The holographic display shifted to show the final moments of the battle. The few remaining human ships, battered almost beyond recognition, were still fighting. Their formations were broken, their communications sporadic, but they refused to surrender. "This is what the Dominion command staff could not understand," Tom said, highlighting one particular transmission. "Listen to this." A human voice crackled through the speakers, weak but determined. "This is Captain Morrison of the Wellington. We have lost main engines, weapons, and life support, but we are still here, we are still fighting, and we will be fighting until there is nothing left to fight with." The alien student sat in stunned silence as more transmissions played. Human after human, ship after ship, reported catastrophic damage while simultaneously asking for target assignments. There was no discussion of surrender, no consideration of retreat, only an endless stream of, "What can we hit next?" This is not normal behavior. whispered one of the aquatic students. How can they maintain morale with such terrible losses? Tom smiled grimly. Because we were not just fighting for our lives. We were fighting for our home, for our families, for the right to exist as a free species. When those things are at stake, humans do not calculate acceptable casualty rates. We calculate how much damage we can do before we die. The display showed the moment when the Dominion fleet began its withdrawal. Thousands of ships, many of them completely undamaged, turning away from Earth and preparing to leave the system. The Great Conquest had become a costly retreat. The Dominion lost 42% of their invasion fleet, Tom announced. 4,200 ships destroyed or damaged beyond repair. Nearly 1 million personnel killed or wounded, all to conquer a single world whose entire military consisted of 300 vessels. Commander Dex's voice was barely a whisper. Those numbers would have bankrupted their war effort. They did, Tom confirmed. The Dominion Empire collapsed within 10 years, not from external conquest but from internal economic failure and civil wars. It turns out that spending your entire military budget to fight one species leaves you vulnerable to everyone else. Tom returned to his seat, leaving the alien students to contemplate what they had learned. The battle they had been taught to see as a human defeat was actually the beginning of the end for one of the galaxy's greatest empires. That is why, Tom concluded, humanity was invited to join the Galactic Federation as equals rather than subjects. Not because we won that battle, but because we proved that conquering us would cost more than any sane civilization was willing to pay. The classroom remained silent, young minds struggling to process the truth about human nature and the day that changed the galaxy forever. The silence in the classroom stretched on like a held breath. Commander Dex stood frozen at his teaching station, his forearms hanging uselessly at his sides as he processed what he had just heard. The alien students remained motionless, their young minds struggling to reconcile everything they thought they knew about warfare with the truth Tom Bradley had just revealed. Finally, a brave aquatic cadet broke the silence. If you were really there, can you tell us what it was actually like? Not the official version, but what you saw and felt during the battle. Tom Bradley settled back into his chair, his weathered face taking on a distant expression. What was it like? He repeated the question slowly, as if testing the weight of the words. It was terrifying, and beautiful, and completely insane all at the same time. The holographic display flickered as Tom accessed the control interface with practiced ease, surprising everyone with his familiarity with the Academy's systems. The image shifted to show the bridge of the UES Defiance during the early hours of the battle. I had been on the bridge for 18 hours straight when the Dominion fleet arrived, Tom began. We knew they were coming. Our deep space sensors had been tracking their approach for weeks. But knowing something and seeing it with your own eyes are very different things. The display zoomed in on the communication station where a young man sat hunched over his equipment, frantically coordinating defensive positions. The resemblance to the elderly Tom was unmistakable, though 50 years had weathered his features beyond easy recognition. That scared kid at the comm station, Tom said with a slight smile. He had no idea what he was getting into. None of us did. We thought we understood war because we had read about it in textbooks and run simulations in training. But nothing prepares you for the real thing. A reptilian cadet leaned forward intently. What was the first moment when you realized this battle would be different from what the textbooks taught? Tom manipulated the display to show the moment when the first Dominion ships entered the minefield. Right there, when their lead elements hit our welcome committee. The holographic explosions bloomed silently in the classroom air. The Dominion commanders had been laughing at us over the comm channels, calling us primitives, making jokes about our antique weapons. The image shifted to show intercepted Dominion communications from that moment. Alien faces filled with confidence and amusement suddenly twisted into shock and confusion as their mighty ships began exploding around them. The laughter stopped real quick. Tom continued. Suddenly we were hearing panic in their voices. Ships that were supposed to be invulnerable were dying. Formations that had conquered dozens of worlds were falling apart under attack by weapons they considered obsolete. Commander Dex found his voice again, though it was strained. How did human forces coordinate such an effective defense with primitive communication systems? Tom chuckled softly. That is the thing about humans, Commander. We do not just prepare for the battles we expect to fight. We prepare for the battles we might have to fight, every scenario, no matter how unlikely. The display showed the vast network of communication relays and sensor platforms the humans had constructed throughout their solar system. Hidden bases on asteroids, weapon caches in the outer planets, backup command centers scattered across multiple worlds. We had been planning for this battle since the day we learned about the Dominion, Tom explained. Not hoping for it, mind you, but preparing for it. Because humans learned long ago that hoping for peace while preparing for war is better than the alternative. The holographic timeline advanced to show the middle phase of the battle when human losses began mounting severely. The alien students watched in fascination as ship after ship reported critical damage, yet continued fighting. This was when I learned something important about my own species, Tom said quietly. I had always wondered how humans would react when faced with truly impossible odds. Whether we would break and run, or find some reserve of strength we did not know we possessed. A crystalline being's lights pulsed with curiosity. And what did you learn? Tom's expression grew proud and sad at the same time. I learned that humans do not break. We bend, we adapt, we get scared and angry and desperate, but we do not break. Not when it matters. The display showed a particularly devastating attack on the human formation. A Dominion world breaker had broken through the defensive line and was systematically destroying human ships with its massive plasma cannons. 3 cruisers died in as many minutes, their crews vaporized before they could even send distress signals. That was when Captain Morrison made a decision that changed everything, Tom said, highlighting one of the remaining human vessels. The Wellington was already badly damaged, but she was the only ship in position to stop that world breaker from breaking our entire line. The alien students watched as the human cruiser altered course, accelerating directly toward the massive Dominion ship. It was obvious to everyone what Captain Morrison intended to do. A suicide run, whispered one of the reptilian cadets. No, Tom corrected firmly. A calculated sacrifice. There is a difference. Morrison knew exactly what he was doing and why it had to be done. His ship could not win a direct engagement with a world breaker, but he could ensure that the world breaker would not survive the encounter either. The collision was spectacular even in the sanitized historical footage. The Wellington, tiny compared to her target, struck the world breaker amidships and both vessels vanished in an expanding sphere of nuclear fire. The shockwave damaged several nearby Dominion ships and completely disrupted their attack formation. That was the moment I understood what we were fighting for, Tom said softly. Not just our lives, or even our world. We were fighting for the right to exist as ourselves, to make our own choices, to live free from the fear that someone stronger could take everything away from us just because they could. The holographic display advanced to show Tom's own ship, taking damage. The UES Defiance shuddered under multiple impacts, her hull breached in dozens of places. The bridge filled with smoke and the acrid smell of burning electronics. 17 direct hits, Tom recounted, his voice steady despite the obvious emotion in his eyes. Our engine room was gone, life support was failing, and our main reactor was showing signs of critical instability. By any reasonable standard, we should have abandoned ship. A young aquatic cadet ventured carefully. But you did not abandon ship. Tom shook his head. Captain Rivers looked around at what was left of his crew and asked a simple question. Do we still have weapons? When we confirmed that we did, he said, then we still have work to do. The display showed the Defiance's final action in the battle. With her engines dead and her hull cracked open, she had become essentially a stationary weapons platform. But her guns were still functional, and her crew was still fighting. We used our dying reactor as bait, Tom explained. Let the Dominion think we were helpless, just another piece of space junk waiting to be finished off. When their boarding teams came close enough, we detonated everything we had left. The explosion that followed took out 3 Dominion assault ships and a light cruiser. The Defiance died, but she took her enemies with her. How did you survive? Asked Commander Dex, his voice barely above a whisper. Tom smiled grimly. luck, stubbornness, and an emergency pod that somehow made it clear of the explosion. I spent the next 6 hours floating in space, watching the battle continue around me, watching my friends and comrades die, watching them take as many enemies with them as they possibly could. The elderly human looked around the room at the young alien faces staring at him with newfound respect and understanding. That is what I remember about that day, Tom concluded. Not the fear, though there was plenty of that. Not the pain of losing so many good people, though that stays with you forever. What I remember most is the pride, the knowledge that when the galaxy's greatest military force came to destroy us, we made them pay such a price that they decided we were too expensive to conquer. The classroom remained silent as the implications of Tom's words sank in. These young aliens were beginning to understand something that their textbooks had never taught them about humans and the day that changed everything. The Academy's afternoon bell chimed through the corridors, but no one in the classroom moved. The scheduled lesson time had ended long ago, but neither Commander Dex nor any of the alien students seemed willing to break the spell that had settled over them. Tom Bradley had transformed their understanding of history with his quiet words, and now they hungered for more. A crystalline cadet, her translucent body pulsing with nervous energy, finally spoke up. "Mr. Bradley, if the battle really ended, the way you described, why do the official histories say something different?" Tom leaned back in his chair, looking every one of his 72 years. "Politics, young one. The same force that starts wars often writes the history books afterward." He gestured toward the frozen holographic display. The Dominion could not admit that they had been fought to a standstill by what they called a primitive species. Their entire empire was built on the idea of technological and military superiority. Commander Dex, who had remained silent for most of Tom's account, finally found his voice. "Are you suggesting that everything we teach about first contact protocols is based on fabricated information?" "Not fabricated," Tom corrected gently. "Selective. The truth has a way of being inconvenient for people in power." He stood up slowly and walked to the holographic display, his weathered hands dancing over the controls with surprising skill. The display shifted to show economic data from the years following the Battle of Sol. Charts and graphs filled the air, showing the dramatic decline of Dominion military spending, the collapse of their colonial expansion, and the rising costs of maintaining their empire. "Look at these numbers," Tom said, pointing to a particularly dramatic downward trend. The Dominion spent 60% of their annual military budget on that single battle, 60%, to conquer one world. He manipulated the display to show comparative data. It had cost them more to attack Earth than it had cost to conquer their previous 50 worlds combined. A young reptilian cadet hissed softly in amazement. "That is economically unsustainable." "Exactly," Tom nodded. Within 5 years, they were pulling back from their outer colonies. Within 10 years, their empire had fractured into a dozen smaller states fighting each other for resources. The great dominion that had terrorized the galaxy for centuries destroyed itself trying to conquer a single human world. The holographic display showed a map of galactic politics before and after the Battle of Sol. The Dominion's vast territory, colored in threatening red, slowly fragmented into smaller, weaker entities. In the space they left behind, new alliances formed. Trade routes shifted. The balance of power across the galaxy fundamentally changed. But the most important change, Tom continued, was not military or economic. It was psychological. Every species in the galaxy learned something new about humans that day. They learned that we fight differently than anyone else. An aquatic student, her gills fluttering with curiosity, asked, "How do humans fight differently?" Tom smiled, but there was no humor in it. "Most galactic species fight to win. Humans fight to make sure the other side loses. There is a difference." He manipulated the display to show casualty ratios from other historical battles. "Look at these numbers. In every major galactic conflict before Sol, the losing side surrendered when their casualties reached 30 to 40%. Standard military doctrine across dozens of species." The alien students studied the data with growing understanding. Battle after battle showed the same pattern: initial engagement, escalating casualties, negotiated surrender when losses became unacceptable. Now, look at human casualty rates during the Battle of Sol, Tom said, highlighting the relevant statistics. 73% casualties, nearly 3/4 of our fleet destroyed, and we never even considered surrender. Commander Dex stared at the numbers in disbelief. That level of casualties should have resulted in complete military collapse and social chaos. For any other species, yes, Tom agreed, but humans do not calculate acceptable losses the same way. When we are fighting for our homes, for our families, for our right to exist, there is no such thing as acceptable casualties. There is only the question of how many enemies we can take with us. The display shifted to show intercepted Dominion, communications from the final hours of the battle. Alien voices, growing increasingly panicked, filled the classroom. "They will not stop fighting," came one transmission. "We have destroyed 70% of their fleet, and they are still attacking. Us request permission to withdraw," came another. "Our casualty projections show complete fleet destruction if we continue this engagement." "This is madness," a third voice declared. "They are using their medical ships as weapons. They are ramming hospital ships into our dreadnoughts. The alien." Students listened in stunned silence as the reality of human warfare became clear. The Dominion commanders, trained in civilized galactic warfare, had encountered something completely outside their experience. An enemy that became more dangerous as defeat became more certain. The turning point, Tom explained, came when Admiral Korthak, the Dominion fleet commander, sent a direct transmission to Earth demanding immediate surrender. He expected our government to respond, to negotiate terms to try to save what they could from the disaster. Tom activated another section of the display, showing the communication logs from that crucial moment. Instead, the response came from Captain Rodriguez of the heavy cruiser Valiant. Her ship was burning, her crew was dying, but she was still in command of her guns. A human voice, steady despite the sounds of battle in the background, crackled through the speakers. "Admiral Korthak, this is Captain Rodriguez. I have your surrender demand. Here is my response." The display showed what happened next. The Valiant, her hull breached and her engines failing, accelerated toward the Dominion flagship. Her final transmission was brief. "You want Earth? Come and take it." The collision destroyed both ships, but more importantly, it destroyed something in the Dominion command structure. The psychological impact of seeing their flagship rammed by a dying human ship broke the enemy's will to continue the battle. "That was the moment," Tom said quietly, "when the Dominion realized they were not fighting a conventional military force. They were fighting an entire species that would rather die than kneel, and that realization terrified them more than any weapon we could have built." The elderly human walked slowly back to his seat, but remained standing. Within hours, the Dominion fleet was in full retreat, not because they could not win, but because winning would have cost them everything they had built over centuries of conquest. A crystalline cadet asked the question that was on everyone's mind. "What happened to you after the battle? How did you end up here, teaching us about military history?" Tom's expression grew thoughtful. "I spent 6 months in a hospital, recovering from radiation exposure and decompression injuries. When I was finally cleared for duty, I found that the galaxy had changed. The Dominion Empire was collapsing, but something new was taking its place. The Galactic Federation was forming, and for the first time in galactic history, it was being built on principles of equality rather than conquest." He sat down heavily, the weight of his years and memories visible in every movement. "I was offered a position in the new Federation military, but I chose to become an educator instead. Because I realized that the most important battles are not fought with ships and weapons. They are fought with ideas and understanding." Tom looked around the room at the young alien faces staring at him with newfound respect. "That is why I'm here at my age, sitting in a classroom with students young enough to be my great-grandchildren. Because the galaxy needs to understand what really happened during the Battle of Sol and what it means for the future." "Commander." Dex cleared his throat nervously. "Mr. Bradley, these revelations will require significant revisions to our curriculum. The implications for military doctrine alone—" "The implications," Tom interrupted gently, "are simple. The galaxy learned that humans do not fight wars the same way everyone else does. We do not fight to win, We fight to survive. And when survival is at stake, there is no limit to what humans will sacrifice to protect what we love. The old human stood up one final time, gathering his few belongings. Remember this lesson, all of you. Not just the facts and figures, but the truth behind them. War is not a game played by rules that everyone agrees to follow. War is what happens when diplomacy fails and civilized beings are forced to choose between submission and survival. As Tom walked toward the classroom door, he paused and looked back at the stunned faces of his fellow students. The Battle of Saul ended 53 years ago, but its lessons are still relevant today. Because somewhere in the galaxy there is always someone who believes that might makes right, that the strong should rule the weak. He opened the door and stepped into the corridor, but his final words carried clearly back into the classroom. And when that someone finally meets humanity, they will learn the same lesson the Dominion learned, that humans may not be the strongest, or the smartest, or the most advanced species in the galaxy, but we are the most stubborn, and sometimes that makes all the difference. The door closed behind him, leaving the alien students and their instructor to contemplate the true meaning of human nature, and the day that changed everything they thought they knew about war, peace, and the price of freedom in a dangerous galaxy.